Welcome to today's conversation on wealth management foundations for intentional growth. We're happy to see so many advisors eager to invest in the health of their firm. For the past 2 decades, advisors have turned to FP Transitions for insights on where and how to build healthy, sustainable businesses of enduring and transferable value. Our team now consists of more than 60 professionals who know just what your unique advisory business needs in order to reach its full potential now and in the future. Today, you'll hear us talk extensively around key performance indicators, or KPIs, which, when managed and monitored correctly, can inform an intentional growth strategy. But here's the thing. As we share insights on which levers and foundational baseline elements are required for amplifying your growth, you should know that not every firm is alike, and we know that too. FP Transitions is inimitably equipped to provide tactical recommendations to businesses like yours because we house data points on more than 15,000 independent advisory businesses from across the industry. From IBD to RIA, from 100 million AUM to several billion AUM, we can tell you where you sit today and what you need to do right now to move forward. Kicking off our conversation today are two of our favorite consultants, Scott Leek and Eric Fettig. But before we get started, please note that you can ask questions throughout the presentation. We'll answer them at the end, and you can also please complete a quick survey to help us understand your current goals and which topics you'd like us to cover next time. Okay, now for today's speakers. We have Scott Leek, CFP. Scott oversees our entire business development team and also serves as one of our primary consultants for RIAs. With decades of experience helping advisors run efficient, top-notch advisory businesses, Scott delivers clear insights that spark growth for independent advisors. And then we have Eric Fettig. As a trusted consultant for independent advisors, Eric spends much of his time crunching numbers and looking at data trends, which he then articulately delivers to clients seeking to build the right foundations within their business. Having navigated growth challenges with hundreds of advisory firms, there's probably no one better matched in the business, and we're pretty lucky to have him for an hour today. All right, Scott and Eric, let's get into it.
Thanks, Jess. One of the things that we want to start with when we're thinking about growth and how do we grow, a lot of advisors are asking the question in the first place because maybe they're not currently hitting their growth goals. So let's spend a little bit of time talking about what are some of the reasons why you might not be hitting growth goals today. One of the obvious reasons that comes up is that advisors have built a business up to a certain point based on things that worked in the past. So there's kind of that old saying of what got you here won't get you there. Maybe you started off in insurance and you gathered a lot of clients through that business, converted them to wealth management clients. And now it's like, all right, how do I go about finding new clients now that I've tapped into that network and that network has been consumed? Additionally, we've got a lot of data that shows that growth slows after advisors hit certain milestones. So for example, if you're a single owner or producer in your firm, you are going to reach capacity in terms of the number of households you can handle. So depending on the level of services and the type of clients that you work with, this tends to be around somewhere in the 100 to 125 household range. So once you hit that, you're probably at capacity. And advisors will often tell us that, hey, I've got a revenue growing problem. But that's actually not diagnosing the problem quite correctly. Most likely the problem is that of capacity, not necessarily marketing or sales. And then additionally, single owner firms tend to see revenue growth decline every decade after age 40. And so 40 to 50, 50 to 60, 60 to 70, et cetera, those growth rates tend to decline every decade, reaching just 4% after age 70. So we've seen this trend be different, however, with multi-owner firms who are more likely to hit their growth goals in general. Eric, what have you seen in some of the advisors that you've worked with here?
Yeah, sure, Scott. I think the general sense is that good business owners, good wealth managers, good sole proprietors have the ability to look forward and see what's coming and be proactive as opposed to reactive to their issues and obstacles, right? So some of the waypoints that you're setting as we max out our capacity, right? A lot of that's driven by science. There's this idea of what's called Dunbar's number, right? Humans can only manage up to 150 social relationships before it becomes too many. So, I think it's really important as we start to look towards how do we grow and answer a question that is really timely, right? We've had a tough 2022 after about 2 decades of record growth. What we're trying to assess is, can we identify where we're headed? right? Do we have the team in place? Do we have the capacity in place? All things we're going to discuss to grow in addition to where we are today. So when you mention things like sole proprietors maxing out at certain relationships, single owners moving to multi-owners, these all becomes tools that we can leverage on our consulting process and within the services provided at FP to help our clients better assess how and where they're going from a growth perspective.
And that's a great lead into, the next points we want to make here. So when we're thinking about, all right, if we've diagnosed that, the challenges with growth might not necessarily be sales or marketing efforts, they might be more foundational. Here are the key components of that foundation that we've identified. And, I kind of think of there's four things we've got here. So you almost want to think of it as you've got four walls on a house, and you need those four walls and able to put a roof on top. And the roof is the growth and the growth goals that you have. But you've got to have those four walls first in order to be able to handle the weight of the growth. So how do you create that foundation for growth? Well, you start with building a talented team and ideally with specialized roles. So you want to make sure you've got proper comp structure and the right people in the right place in the organization. You also want to make sure you've got operations in order, particularly operational efficiency. This is where your technology often comes into play, and leveraging that for better processes, more efficient, effective production and operations. And then you also want to think about creating a superior client experience. So serving what you have and serving it well. And then the last one, and this is one you might not see other organizations talk about, but it's the sustainability of the organization itself. And we'll talk to some data points later as to why this is important. But one of the key things we do here is focusing on succession planning, helping advisors build enduring sustainable businesses. And we think that without that, growth can be strained, but with it, it can be very exponentially beneficial. And Eric, again, I think that with the work that you do here, you've probably seen a lot of this as well. What are some of the components you've seen, particularly on the talent side?
Yeah, these are pillars, right, to running a good business. Again, it's not just growth, but whether it's four walls on a house or four tires, right, on a car built to go the distance, if we don't have the right people in place, if we don't have the right operations in place, if we're not doing the best work for our client and we're not built to last, not only aren't we going to grow, but we're probably going to run into the ground. So I think in the body of this presentation, Scott, we'll get into some of these individual bullet points, but without a doubt, talent, operations, client experience, and sustainability are pivotal to the success of any wealth management business.
And I know you work with a lot of advisors on things like talent and helping them with compensation structuring. So let's get into the talent component a little bit. Some of the basic questions to ask there is, do you have enough people to support your growth goals? Then do you have the right people to use the analogy from good to great? Do you have the right people on the bus, and are they in the right seats? For a lot of advisors, when it does come time to say, okay, yeah, maybe I am at capacity, I should hire. The next question usually that we get is, where should I hire? So one of the things that I often recommend for people is you're most likely going to want to start with an associate advisor. That's probably the best place to create more capacity, or someone who's dedicated, particularly in a management role, maybe in operations. So delegate as much as you can. If you're the founder or the top revenue producer of your firm, delegate as much non-revenue producing tasks to a centralized operations associate can be really huge there. So Eric, I'll have you talk a little bit about this kind of attract and retain, and what are some of the components that go into that?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. So, financial advisors, they like to hire entry-level positions. One, they're cheaper, candidly. What we see is that lead advisors are typically built from within. So we have people coming in at entry-level positions, and they ascend through the roles and responsibilities established within the entity to hit that lead advisor, go out and gather new assets role. That's important for a number of reasons. One, they're culture keepers in your business. So the culture that you set, the type of service you provide, those are most likely coming from people who have time and tenure in your business and less from advisors that you've acquired. Absolutely, bringing on talent through acquisition becomes one arm of your larger growth strategy. But the focus is first building your bench, building your farm team, to use an analogy internally, and grow them to that lead advisor role or that portfolio manager role or that COO role. Now, it's important to have that career growth in order to retain talent, but also to attract talent, right? To say, hey, look, Eric's come into your business as a service advisor, and over the last 6 years, he's hit these waypoints and become a lead advisor, and he's being considered for other opportunities like equity, synthetic equity, different bonus structures. So having the ability to hiring the right people, growing them internally, also acts as a tool to attract others, but also to retain. And when we start talking about retaining, that's where we're going to dovetail into things like compensation, succession, opportunities for 30, 35, 40-year-olds to make a career length investment in your business. I'll pause there, Scott. Anything else you want to add?
No, I think this is a great point to the next slide we've got here, is that, larger, more diverse teams can actually achieve quite a bit. And I think you touched on a lot of these already, but to expand on this a little bit more, that as you build a team and as it becomes more diverse, you've got the opportunity for greater service offerings. If you've got people that can start to specialize, some practices are going to start to bring in people that might have specialties in tax or retirement planning that not one single person can do. It also can help expand the footprint in the community. So not just from the standpoint of, being good stewards of your community, but, from a growth perspective, the more people you have out there that are working at your firm and talking about what your firm does, the more that builds the network and the brand of the organization. And that then leads to helping build a larger, more diversified client base. So there's a lot of things that this provides, but one of the things that we find most important is that this really helps with business and client continuity. And that goes, again, to that kind of sustainability thing that we talked about. We really stress the importance of doing business continuity planning. And one of the best places to build a continuity plan is from within the organization.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one observation that I've made, over the course of several years here running succession plans, acquisitions, et cetera, a lot of partners, a lot of producers look to hire someone that is identical to themselves, right? They want a type A or type B person who's going to go out and get it and drive the top line. Important people to have on your team, but more importantly, adding those who are going to supplement and complement your strengths and weaknesses rounds you out. And being more rounded out, I think, makes you more durable. But what it also does is it makes you more holistic in your planning and approach to your client service model. So bringing in not just those who are matching with the thoughts and the process and the theme of producers and owners in the business, but also those who may run, kind of afoul of maybe some of those principles, give you a nice balance that helps you go the distance, as opposed to magnifying strength, but also magnifying weakness that maybe exists in the current ownership circle.
Absolutely. And not to get too far into the weeds on succession planning, but I think that's something that a lot of advisors think about when they're thinking who's going to be the next generation owners that come into the business. They might have a tendency to try to bring in people who are like themselves instead of people that might be complementary. And one of the biggest things I tell advisors, particularly if you started the company and you were a solo owner to begin with, the buck stopped with you. And so if you're going to bring in 2, 3, 4 people to be the next generation owners, you don't want someone with that mentality necessarily. You might want someone who's actually going to be more collaborative and have to work well with others. And that's not something that you maybe had to do as a single owner to start with.
Yeah, incredibly important to define people, process, role, responsibility. As again, you start to become more forward-looking, hit the growth targets you want to hit. And so It's super important to supplement tactical work that we do also with the more subjective stuff in order to have a business that's going to be durable.
Spot on.
So Scott, the next slide here is on compensation. I'm happy to drive on these topics.
Yeah, please do.
We'll punch over to the next slide. So compensation is a hot topic. It always is, with teams looking to add more headcount on their ensemble. And the observation is that compensation for teams hasn't grown in lockstep with record growth and profits that we've seen in the last 5, 10, 15 years for financial services businesses. And, thinking about why that is probably outside the scope of this conversation. But I would say what's important to note is that having a competitive, mature, and appropriate compensation plan supports some of those bullets we saw in previous slide around retention and attraction. So as far as compensation is concerned, we want it to be a multi-pronged approach, right? We want to have compensation coming from salary, and salary should be benchmarked to industry norms. Yeah, you can make some regional adjustments, but generally do your best to define a role, which is the biggest challenge, and then work north or south of that. So we have salary being a component of compensation for staff, advisors, owners. We also want to add a bonus component. And the bonus component is meant to incentivize the behaviors that as a company, you've put the appropriate amount of weight on. We've defined our mission, values, and goals. We want to have our bonus structure align with what we set as a company. Wages, a merit raise as inflation and cost of living adjustments occur, a bonus that aligns with firm mission core values. And then we often see as firms get more sophisticated, this idea of synthetic equity. Without touching too much on synthetic equity, it becomes a tool to treat someone like more than an employee, but less than an owner. So we have salary, we have bonus, we have a half measure between full-blown stock and just salary and bonus. Lastly, we use equity, share ownership in our company as that final tool to attract talent, right? We want to create a culture of putting stock in play. We want to say, hey, if you come to our firm, we have a history of putting stock in play. We have a vehicle to pay for it. And if you do what we expect, you're going to be considered. So having a compensation structure that aligns with what you're trying to do as a company is going to help you with retaining talent, attracting talent, and having talent means you have more capacity, you have more skill, you have more bandwidth to grow. Without that, you're managing too many relationships, your client affluence isn't changing, and you're going to plateau and probably ride the market more than net new assets that you're gathering from share of wallet or new clients.
Right. And I think for a lot of advisors, this, like you said, this is something we get asked about a lot, with all the data that we've gathered from doing 1,000 valuations a year for the last, 20 years, we've got substantial data on this. And so, we really recommend benchmarking your compensation. I would say at least biannually, along with all the other KPIs that we're going to measure when we do a benchmark. But in a year like this, where we've had high inflation, we've got low unemployment, you might want to even consider doing this on an annual basis because talent is really hard to come by right now. And you want to make sure that you're, I would say, at least at the median of what the comp should be for each person in your organization, if not even slightly above it, to make sure that you're keeping your people. And when it comes to finding that right balance between, how much should be base salary, how much should be bonus, generally speaking, you want to have that base salary to be high enough to be enticing, but you also don't want your fixed costs to get out of control. And so by having that bonus structure, you're able to have people participate in the success of the company. You want to make sure that if the company's doing well, people are doing well, but you're not necessarily tying yourself to those fixed costs of high wages that if the company struggles, and you maybe have a down market like we had in 2022, where revenues might have decreased, the variable comp can help cushion that a little bit. And then, to your point about the synthetic equity, I do think that's something that is good for larger organizations to consider, not necessarily as a way to avoid succession planning or avoid giving equity. I think of it more as a tool to use when you've got someone that they might not be ownership material, or they might not be comfortable becoming an owner in the organization, but they still need to be rewarded as if they were an owner. So there's certainly something to talk to us about if that's something you're interested in, but certainly not something for everyone.
Yeah, it's a test, right? It's both
right.
Ready to go to the next step, or is this where you're going to sit? And there's nothing wrong with the outcome. Lastly, I'll add, replacement cost of losing an employee is something like 200% of their wage. So don't be bashful or scared to pay people appropriately, because losing them has ripple effects all throughout the P&L, client service. You spend your time now doing what they used to do. You have to train somebody else to get up to speed. It puts you back and keeps you from focusing on what you need to do. Just go out and meet people and gather assets and be good stewards of their portfolios. So, compensation should be benchmarked. Nothing is evergreen with compensation or bonus pools. It needs to be revisited constantly. And that's, work that FP or others can do in this space to help you feel confident that at least you're in or out when it comes to how you're paying your people.
Right. So let's move on to the kind of the second pillar, second wall, whatever analogy you want to use, and talk a bit about operational efficiency. And this comes from one of the other key components that we do when we're helping advisors build enterprises. We really focus on three key components of making sure you've got the right entity structure, organizational structure, and compensation structure. So we already talked about the compensation structure. Let's talk a little bit more about your org design. And really, you want to make sure that you're operating efficiently. And the key to that is profit margins. So, you want to make sure that you keep adding people as you reach capacity for each advisor. But are there things you can do to possibly expand the capacity of each advisor? And that is often done through proper organizational design, through strategic planning, things like client segmentation, and then absolutely, leveraging technology that's going to help increase the scale of your business as well. Now, in general, we do have data that shows that an advisor can only handle a certain number of clients or a certain amount of AUM or a certain amount of revenue. Any one of those is a perfectly reasonable way to measure it. But those numbers can be improved with proper strategic planning and with the right operational efficiency gains. So, you can use technology to automate some tasks. You can use that to alleviate advisor time constraints. You want to make sure you're documenting common key processes, creating workflows. A lot of these things that I think a lot of people on this phone already know. And that client segmentation, certainly helping with creating repeatable processes for similar clients. Again, that's something to do to bring in some capacity or scale. But we kind of throw these terms around, Eric, of capacity and scale. And so I wonder if you could spend a moment just kind of talking about the difference between the two and why it's important to be managing towards these in order to help provide those foundations for growth.
Yeah, I think they're part and the same. They're kind of two sides of the same coin. Capacity really reflects the volume a system can handle. So if you think of the capacity of your client service model, it's the true value or the true volume that the people you have in place can handle at any given point. Now, scale really reflects the ability for your system, right, your client service model, to grow as demand increases. And scale can often be bolstered or supported, for your previous slide, with investments in technology, marketing, client segmentation, et cetera. The capacity is really driven around the talent you have and the people you have. And that kind of goes back to, can we hire the right people? Can we pay them well? And can we retain them? So using things like the appropriate compensation structure and having things like clearly defined career trajectories within our firm allows us to build capacity. And then the tools we have, such as technology or shared efficiencies and skill amongst employees, allows us to scale as the demand increases, right? We can have high capacity and low scale. We can have the inverse of that, low scale, but high capacity. I think the general takeaway, without getting into the minutia, is we want to be thinking of what is our capacity with our current team, and can we scale as we grow? If the answer is, no to scale, or we're under capacity, what can we do to build that capacity or scale? And the answer is pretty simple, right? Hire more people or invest in other resources like technology to help us scale. Now, it's easy to say that when we have record profits, not so easy when we're coming off of an incredibly high year of inflation and down markets. So this is where we're reactive in some of the things we observe. And now we go, oh crap, we have to hire a bunch of people and invest in technology. And we should have been doing that 2-3 years ago. So it's a really poignant time, I think, in the space to sit down, do a little bit of a heat check on our 10-year record growth and say, okay, if we want to go from X to Y million, do we have the capacity and can we scale to achieve that? Or do we need to go back and look at some of the things Scott was talking about, which is how is our structure? Are we operationally efficient? Who reports to whom? How flat or vertical is our organization? So scale and capacity, I think, are underlying, key attributes of growth, and they need to be kept in consideration when we start talking about where we're headed as a firm.
When I'm walking through our benchmark report with some of our clients, one of the things that we focus on is differentiating between what's the revenue strength of the organization and what's the enterprise strength of the organization. And so these two things really fall under that category of enterprise strength. And one of the common questions I get when we're going through that part is, okay, Scott, you're telling me I probably need to hire, but I don't necessarily know when the right time to hire is. Is it when I'm at 50% capacity, 75, 100? The answer generally is around 80%. Now, give or take the number of services you're providing and how fast you're growing, that might affect it. If you're growing above 9% revenue per year, you might want to hire a little bit sooner than 80% capacity. If you're below that, you might be able to drag it out until you're at 90% capacity. But if you wait until you're at 100%, you don't have the time to properly go out and find someone to do interviews, properly onboard them, to train them. If you wait until you're at full capacity, you are going to be doing a disservice, and you're going to end up slowing down in the process of doing so. It's tough to hire. It's tough to hire before you've got the revenue to support that person. But it is something that I think it's really worth highlighting. You cannot wait until you're at capacity to bring the next person on board. Yeah,
and to create a little urgency, there's fewer and fewer people getting into the space every year. Right? Talent is decreasing. 40% of advisors are said to retire in the next 10 years. Half of those are sole proprietors, so they have their own thing to figure out. The other half of those don't have a plan. So there's a battle for talent that squeezes each year as less and less comes into the market. And the larger, sophisticated, more cash-rich firms are making a play to hire those talented people today. So you can weigh things in terms of capacity, but I would say it behooves you to at least consider today looking at that next hire, because pretty soon we could turn around and there's nobody left. So really be thinking about when that hire needs to happen. Keep it in context of your capacity, sure, but don't be scared to bring on talent if it means you're going to have a successor, a right-hand man or woman, someone who can carry the culture that you are building, and to have the talent you need to grow. Because if you don't have that, eventually you'll drive yourself nuts managing 500 relationships, and doing what you do won't be enjoyable.
That's certainly something that we see, and it's going to come through in what you're delivering to the clients. And so this gets us to our third foundation needed in order to handle growth, and that's delivering a superior client experience. And I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this, but I think this is certainly something that's worth highlighting, that it starts with why. Understanding what's the vision and mission of the firm. These are keys to creating the culture of the organization that's going to permeate from the leadership on its way down to its associates, and then gets passed out to the clients. So it's helpful to understand what is your ideal client profile, and how do you, particularly if you have a niche, that's going to help you better create a unique and differentiated client experience for those people. But the more you understand your clients, the better you're able to attract more like them, and then they can help you recruit and bring in new clients as well. But to get referrals in the first place, you've got to be referable, and that begins with delivering experience that makes them talk. Next thing, and this is really one of our key areas of expertise here at FB Transitions, and this is our final foundation for handling growth, and that is about sustainability. So, really focusing on making a business that is enduring, that is sustainable, that is going to be multi-generational. So you need to be able to sit across the table from your clients and tell them your organization is going to be around to support them and their family. I'm 45 years old. My parents are in their 70s. If I didn't already have an advisor and my parents wanted me to use theirs, the first question I'm going to ask their advisor is, how old are you and who's going to take over the organization when I'm my parents' age? And if they don't have an answer for that, I'm not hiring that advisor at my age. And for a lot of advisors out there right now, I'm in my peak earning years. I'm at a great age to be recruiting clients. So I'm going to show some demographics on that in a moment here. So we need to think about, are you doing what you need to do in order to attract and retain the next generation of clients, as well as our earlier discussion of attracting the next generation of talent. And again, this is where this kind of virtuous circle begins of you do proper succession planning, create those equity pathways, offer that opportunity for ownership. You're going to recruit and retain talent. And this is something that certainly, Eric, I know you deal with in a lot of the discussions you have with your clients. So I'm curious what additional things you have to add here.
Yeah, I think as investment professionals, our duty and responsibility, first and foremost, is to our clients and their families, right? And to not be able to say that I'll be around or our company will be around if I'm not lies in the face of that mentality. So it's somewhat upsetting to say a lot of the space doesn't even have a succession plan because what poor stewardship it represents to the clients. So succession becomes pivotal, for durability in the ensemble. It helps you get cash out of the business that you built and preserve the value that you've created over your lifetime. But it also gives you something that I think isn't measurable, which is the ability to sit across the table from someone and say, yeah, we have X, Y, and Z people in place so that if I'm not here, if I choose to retire, if I pass, you and your family will be taken care of. So having succession in play is a no-brainer, and I think a non-starter, right? If you're building a business, it has to happen, or else why are you building a business in the first place? Having succession plan or an idea of succession then opens you up to tools that you don't have without one. You have equity that you can play and trade amongst your advisor team to help them buy into more income, to more experience, to more value. So equity, succession, compensation, attraction of talent, retaining of talent, all go hand in hand. And when we have those things done, it's easier said than done, of course, we're able to grow.
Yeah, and that gets us to the next point here. So we've talked about these foundations. So if we've got those in place, now we're in a position to be able to focus on what do we do to actually grow. So the ability to attract the right clients, I think, is an important component of this. Not just any clients, but who are the ideal clients. And again, it goes back to that scale and capacity. Having an ideal client profile is going to be something really important to make sure that you are being systematic and strategic about what clients you're going after. Because if you can onboard more and more of the same types of clients, that is a way to increase your capacity to handle even more clients and be able to handle that growth. And then being able to differentiate is important as well. It used to be that, particularly for advisors who are RIAs, they are fiduciaries. And a lot of RIAs that I know would say that is how I'm differentiating. I'm stating that I'm a fiduciary. Well, over the last 20 years, we've seen such an explosion in the number of advisors that have gone the RIA route that's not really a differentiator in and of itself anymore. And yes, you can still compete against the wirehouses on that, but it's getting harder and harder to say that's your differentiator. Or even saying I'm of a certain size and my business is this big, that's a differentiator. That's becoming harder and harder to do, given a lot of the M&A in the marketplace and how much we're seeing firms come together in mergers or acquisitions in order to create that capacity and scale. So Eric, anything that stands out to you of some of the firms? I know you work with some of the really more successful firms that we work with that are growing at really large clips.
Yeah,
anything stand out to you?
I think that, one observation is the most successful revenue generating firms that we see offer a suite of services that are more holistic than maybe for regulation purposes in the non-RIA space or size restrictions exist for others. And we're talking about estate planning. We're talking about more, boutique family office work, and it's easy to say, sure, just do more and you can differentiate. But the observation is those larger firms that have more revenue and more margin are doing more and providing more holistic planning services and referrals than maybe someone doing just a kind of bread and butter financial advisory work. So that exists at the $5, $10, $15 million range. not as common, kind of below that. So differentiating is important, but I would say more importantly, as you grow, it's getting your house in order, becoming operationally mature, focusing on the bottom line. That's going to solve a lot of problems.
For sure. And, a lot of advisors come to us when organic growth has maybe slowed down. And so they say, all right, maybe it's time I start doing some inorganic growth. I start focusing on M&A. And unfortunately, that's not the right way to look at it. Solving for a lack of organic growth with inorganic growth isn't going to work. And the reason for that is in order to do a successful merger, acquisition, tuck-in, whatever it is you're looking to do for that inorganic growth, you need to also already be growing organically to be attractive for that partner that you're bringing into the business. So if you simply think about if you put yourself in the person's shoes that you're looking to bring on board, if they've got options, and they do, who are they going to choose? If they're going to choose between a firm that's not growing and a firm that is growing, it's pretty obvious they're going to pick the firm that is growing. But the reason this is important too, if you think about it from a succession standpoint, if someone you're going to merge with or someone you're going to tuck in, if they're going to get equity in your business, it is vital that they get equity in a business that is already growing. If they're going to have debt, particularly if you're doing succession planning, if they're going to have debt in order to have a seller financed or bank financed note in order to buy into the organization, profit margins have to be of a certain level and profits need to be growing in order for them to afford this. And so if you're trying to solve for the lack of organic growth by solving it with inorganic growth, that is not going to be a successful strategy in the long run. Some of the data that we see when we look at where is growth coming from and what are the results of it, one of the numbers that really stood out, and I mentioned it earlier as a little teaser, is 9% revenue growth. So that's about the historical revenue growth rate of the last 10 years. And there is really interesting differences between firms that are growing more than 9% and growing less than 9%. So again, with all the data that we have in our database, we're able to go into our data environment and kind of manipulate the numbers by isolating different cohorts. So what we did here was we looked at what are some of the differences between firms growing at these two rates. Some of the main findings that we had was that profit per owner in a firm that is growing less than 9% is around $440,000 a year. But for profit per owner in a firm that's growing by more than 9% revenue, profit per owner is close to $600,000 a year. So all other things being equal, profit per owner is a lot higher in firms growing a lot faster. And furthermore, firms that are growing with, or firms with more than one owner grow a lot faster than firms that have a single owner. And I mentioned that earlier as well. We're looking at about 11.9% net new client growth for single owner firms and a whopping 21.1% growth rate on net new clients for multi-owner firms. And I do really recommend that this be a metric that you track. And if you're able to do it on your own, that's fantastic. If you want to use an organization like FP Transitions to help you benchmark, this is something we can help you measure as well. But net new client growth can do two things for you. Number one, it can help you focus on what is the leading indicator of future revenue growth. If you think about the growth of net new clients in 2022, of all the clients you might have brought into your organization, you didn't have a full year's worth of revenue. You didn't necessarily onboard them on January 1st, depending on whether you're billing in advance or arrears. All of these things might affect what the actual revenue growth rate was. So net new client growth can often be a leading indicator of future revenue growth. And we see multi-owner firms growing substantially faster in net new clients than single owner firms. Lastly, I want to talk about the fact that, and this was a number that kind of surprised me a little bit when I looked at the data, that client affluence among firms growing by 9% was a little bit lower. It was $745,000 versus firms growing less than 9% were near $900,000 on average client affluence. And when we looked at it a little bit further, one of the things that we found was that if you look at the demographic data between these two groups, The ones that are growing by more than 9% have far more clients in the 31 to 50 age range and actually have the same number of clients in the over 70 age range. Whereas if you look at the clients growing or the firms that are growing under 9%, 31 to 50-year-old clients, they only have 17% of their client base there, and they're at 28% on over 70. There is a big difference in valuation between clients of these age groups. So again, if you're thinking about long-term, the value of the company, you want to be attracting younger clients. Older clients are starting to decline. So those firms that are maybe sitting at 900,000 household average, that's because their clients have reached probably peak net worth. The clients in the 30 to 50-year-old age range are in those peak earning years. And again, you're looking at future revenue, future valuation growth by attracting more of those younger clients. So that is something those firms growing over 9% are really doing well at. And that's something that, again, is probably a result of them more likely being multi-owner firms, having younger advisors who are then bringing in younger clients. Last thing we want to talk about regarding this is, how do you know if your organic growth is performing, and how do you know how it's comparing to market performance? So I mentioned before that, when you're looking at benchmarking, measuring revenue, that can often mask, the market can mask actual growth of the organization. That's why that net new client number might be a better measurement. So when we're trying to do benchmarking, you're trying to compare your performance, your organic growth might be better measured by net new clients rather than measuring revenue. Eric, anything else from a benchmarking standpoint or organic growth you want to add here?
Well, I just think it's again a pivotal cog in the growth machine, which is, can we assess, new clients less what we have from, disbursements and attrition, and say, separate from the historically high market growth that we've experienced, are we still growing because of years like 2022 when the market doesn't grow, and are we diversified enough in our income stream and our investment style to protect us when we don't have market growth like we've seen historically, when instead we have a downturn like we did in 2022. So I think just thinking about it, right, taking the time to think about what is our organic growth, how are we structured, are we, operationally efficient, operationally mature, do we have the four walls and the roof, like Scott, you were talking about, put you in a tier really, above and beyond kind of the average person when they start thinking about their business. So net new clients, net new revenue, net new assets, an important metric when compared to the growth that occurs in the market.
Thanks, Eric. Looking at those foundations, those pillars, a lot of those can be addressed with some of the core competencies of FP transitions. So, when it comes to understanding your business insights, doing evaluation, doing benchmarking, and the consulting services we have can be really of great value there. And we've got a couple of different ways in which we can service advisors. So we want to make sure that we're helping create those sustainable, enduring businesses that are going to extend beyond the individual career of that founder, help with business longevity, increasing profitability. These are things that are going to help protect the value of the firm for years to come. And certainly we're known for our M&A expertise. We do over 100 M&A transactions every year, and those do provide powerful growth opportunities. But sometimes before you get to that point, you need to understand the strengths of the business, the structure of the business, before you can buy or even sell or merge. Those are things that are going to really help ensure you've got a smooth transition and with maximum client retention. So we highly encourage you to work with us as trusted consultants in the industry who can serve in two key different ways. So number one, we've got a service that we refer to as enterprise consulting. So a lot of the things we talked about today are about building those walls and having that strong foundation for an enduring enterprise. So for anyone who needs help determining, should I work on my compensation strategy? Should I redesign it? Should I implement a synthetic equity plan? Should I do succession planning and start offering real equity? All of those are services that we can start managing through our enterprise consulting process. Those are more project-based consulting services that we can provide. But for a lot of advisors, they might not have a very specific project in mind. They just need things like making sure they've got a business continuity plan, that the business has been valued and benchmarked. And those are things that are provided with our equity management solution membership service. So that's more of an ongoing consulting work that we do, where you have someone that's with you, you're having ongoing conversations with them, and that's a annual service that we provide. So for anyone who needs to know a little bit more about our services, please visit our website, contact one of our sales professionals.